Okay, in this presentation, I'm going to very quickly go through some of the issues that some of you are having in the courts conflict uh, video and then that quiz. I'm going to provide the correct answers only so that you can try to memorize those and get used to thinking about why your answers were different for those of you who got them wrong. And then I'm going to end with why it matters and how to prepare for the last 2 weeks of this course. So I just wanted to present the information that students answered at the end of the quiz. So I want you to think about not so much this part of like what's right and wrong, but more about how there's so many different ways of thinking about uh, the information that was presented to you, because a lot of this is based on your unique individual experience. Um, so I think, one issue that we want to think about um, is I think you need to try to put things in historical perspective. So, for instance, if I look at the third answer down, 85 to 90 laws are no legislation. The legal system is based historically by white men. Um, by white men, you all need to understand that that is not, we don't mean skin color in that sense. We mean culture. And I'll go to this answer later, but we're talking about English folks. So some of this gets lost in the arguments that you see in politics, and especially as people kind of um, this kind of Instagram, Facebook culture, right? So people aren't really thinking very much; they're just saying things. Um, but you think about something pretty carefully. If most of the humans that colonized the eastern seaboard of what is now the United States were from England, and they were white men, it would be natural and understandable that they would base their legal and political system on their historical background rather than somebody else's system. Um, I guess this is a common misunderstanding, um, but immigrants in the United States today still represent less than 50% of the US population. So I just want to counter this concept that is kind of maybe running wild, um, that there's some system out there that exists somewhere else that would be better representative of the people in the United States. I say this because you have to start thinking about how immigrants and how different cultural points of view can participate and force recognition in a system that is not designed to do that. And I'm not aware of any other political system in any other country. If I go to Russia, for example, that political system is not concerned with the viewpoints of people from Brazil and so forth. So I just want to make sure that we're talking about culture and we're not talking about the made up concept of race. Um, the other thing is that, you want to think about kind of this. I like this question: can the Catholic system affect the legal system? Of course, and it has, right? First of all, I don't have time, obviously, in this 6 week course, but in the regular course, and something you probably should have learned in your history courses, is that Catholics were not allowed to come to the United States at the founding of the United States in 1776. So it is interesting at this period of time that there's a Catholic House majority speaker. There are now over a majority of Catholics on the Supreme Court, and now there's a Catholic president, and he's only the second Catholic president. So, Catholics do have an influence. The bigger question would be, in what ways do they influence the political system? And that would depend, I guess, on what type of Catholic you are, right? And you'll want to think about, how does that come up against atheists? How does that come up against evangelical Christians, like the one, like the president we just replaced? And how different views of religion affect the political process. I think there's this kind of, what I need you to do in this class is get past the real non-thinking arguments to start thinking deeply, right? Because judges don't take their job lightly, and lawyers don't either. And so when we're talking about law, we're talking about something very differently than what you're seeing on your TV or what you're seeing on Facebook. And so these aren't simple answers, and they have very complicated structures of how to make the decisions. So we can't just say kind of like, police do this or police don't do that, right? We have to think deeper. And we have to think about the institution of policing, not the individuals of policing. The institution of the judicial system, not the individuals. So we're not talking about your uncle, right? We're talking about the institution as a whole. So, there's a lot of kind of misinformation that I think people are now just starting to understand, right? So you see a couple of these comments are based on that understanding. So when somebody says, is somebody out of order in court, do they actually go to jail for that? In real life, I've never heard of anyone being out of order. I have seen that on TV, and I know that's something somebody say. When people are committing a crime, it doesn't really matter if it's in a courtroom or if they're in a street, right? Or if they're in a school. If there's a crime committed, then they will be charged with that crime, assuming there's evidence. So it doesn't matter where they're doing it. So if somebody jumps over the table and then starts to attack another person in the court, right, that's assault. It doesn't matter that it happened in the courtroom. Out of order in TV is usually the judge indicating to the group of people who are spectating, right, that they need to come back into order. It comes from parliamentary procedure, and you could look up the rules, Robert's Rules of Order, if you wanted to learn more about that. But that's not really something that would be a learning outcome of this particular class, as it's not particularly relevant. But I wanted to pull that example out because it kind of shows the difference between what we see on TV, what we think is a common practice, and the really boring reality of what it's like to be a judge or a lawyer, where you're mostly dealing with books and you have to read a lot. So it's not really as glamorous as TV puts it. I'm glad that some people were able to see that they learned a lot. I'm not really sure how to answer the Trump question. I'm not really quite sure what the question is. So a sitting president can't be charged with a crime, so maybe that answers some of that question. But it's irrelevant, right? Because he lost the election. I pulled out Trump in that to show, right, how a political leader falls into the same traps as ordinary people. So it's almost like a kid, right? They want to make an excuse as if that should get rid of the rule, right? The rule stays in. We don't have to apply rules, right? I mean, lots of people don't apply the rules a lot of the time, right? You forgive people, you forget, you move on with your life, but the rule is still there, right? So the rule doesn't go away just because somebody doesn't like it or has an excuse. Trump is just probably the best example of recent times of somebody who's been so vocal about having excuses and having exceptions to apply to him, and not really wanting to have the rules apply to him, but he wants them to apply to everybody else. There's lots of people who behave like that way, but he just was the loudest. So let me give you these kind of general thoughts as I kind of go through the answers, and hopefully this will make some parts of this a little bit clearer. But I really want you to think right now. I want you to get a paper out or take a picture, whatever's going to help you remember, and just start remember these answers, right? That was the goal of this particular quiz. So if we put things into tribal language, right? If we try to get you to think of like groups as tribes, as a group of people who have some allegiance to each other, that's not based in being, married or family, right? So something else. That's what constitutes the difference between kin and a tribe. So police would represent one tribe, right? As an institution, as a group of people. And that would be the representatives of the ruling elite. In other words, the ruling elite don't come out and enforce their own laws. They hire police officers, right? They hire security guards. They hire people to do that job for them. And that's really, when we think about it, who the police work for. I know liberal progressives won't like that answer, although if we think about it for a while, you'll see that that's true, right? That they're there to protect the property owning class interests. And resistors then to the police, and we're thinking mostly of Black Lives Matter here, represent this counterculture. But it was the same thing in this populist uprising with the Trump supporters. They're not really protesting against police. They're protesting against the people who pay the police, the people who provide the training for the police, the people who shield the police, et cetera, right? So the police are kind of caught in the middle of this conflict, though they tend to represent the ruling elite more than their own interests and their own kin-based interests. So you just want to see this as a process, right? That it's not fixed, it's dynamic, that there's this kind of back and forth that's going. The counterculture is the one saying, we don't like the elite's culture. We're trying to resist it. And the elite are saying, well, we want to use the police to ensure that you follow this culture. And this is pretty typical throughout history and in different societies. It's not unique to the United States. I liked this, this question was just to try to see if you're paying attention to the presentation. So if you got this question wrong, you need to go watch that video again, as Dr. Chapman says. So a courtroom is always clean, secure, ordered, and abides by the rule of law. This is really attacking, it's false, right? This is attacking your idea that rules are always followed, that there's always consequences for not following rules, right? The place where rules are supposed to be followed, it doesn't even always work. So you just need to get out of this kind of romantic, naive idea that people are following the rules all the time. I don't know if you're saying it to me because you're thinking I think that's true, but we all live in the real world, right? So we all know that that's not true, right? Real world is much messier than what we'd see on, say, TV. A lot of people got this one wrong. So the myth of rights is not saying that rights aren't real. That would be ridiculous and kind of insane. People certainly believe it's real, and I don't even know what you mean by real in that answer, right? Rights are certainly not real as in the sense that they're a material thing. They're not a material object like a rock, but they're real in the same way that honesty is real, or lying is real, or love is real, right? But what's more important here is that rights mean the same thing to everybody. That's the myth, right? That everybody kind of believes in this narrative, in this story. Myths aren't necessarily false, right? They're something that we all agree to. It's like mythology, a fairy tale. So fairness, protections, opportunity, equality, and so on are things that we all believe are important, that we all believe are real. The myth is that they're automatic, right? That they just come freely and naturally, and that you don't have to work with them. That's the false part of it. So judges use this process of making decisions. They take a rule, a legal rule, they apply it to the case, and then they draw a conclusion. That's what I'm trying to get you to do in this class. Most of you are drawing conclusions first, right? And that's that knee-jerk Facebook, Instagram way of answering questions, right? I have an opinion. It's not a very informed opinion. It's not a very thought out. It's not critical. It's just the first thing that comes to your mind. In general, that's almost always wrong, no matter what the situation is, right? Thinking about things, looking at situations from multiple points of view and deriving a rule from that, right? Gravity was not something that somebody just looked out in the world and said, oh, gravity, that makes sense. You have to apply reason to it. You have to look at multiple contexts. You have to do things over and over again, trial and error, right? That's what we're kind of getting at here. And then you apply it to particular cases to see if the rule applies to that case. So sometimes the rule doesn't apply to that case, and then you'll see that in part 3. Legal change is not enough, right? It will not do things by itself, and this goes back to the myth of rights, because you're going to need some kind of legislative change and cultural change, and you can't just have one or the other there. You have to have all 3 things, right? And probably if you have cultural change, you'll get legislative change, and then you'll get legal change. But it doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes you can have legislative change and that influences the culture, and then you get legal change. And sometimes you get legal change first, and then you get legislative change, and then you get cultural change. And again, that will be in part 3 where you see the application of that. Most of you got this one correct, so I'm glad. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. This is true of all rules in legal thinking, right? So if you did not know that something was supposed to be churned in a certain way, that doesn't matter, right? If you did not meet a deadline for a court filing because you didn't look up the deadline, that doesn't matter. In other words, there are no excuses to violate the rules. There are only exceptions, and those exceptions will be in the rules themselves. So you'd have to be aware of that exception. And that's really civil law. That's what the legislation does, is it sets out what the rules are, how you can follow them, how they have to be upheld, etc. So most people don't go to the trouble of actually reading legislation, and they think they know what the rules and laws are. Somebody a couple days ago emailed me a Wall Street Journal opinion article about a change that Joseph Biden had implemented through an executive order, and they thought this was crazy and that it was politics. But they didn't bother actually reading the legislation to see that what Biden did was actually just consistent with the law. Again, if people aren't taking the time to critically reflect and think about things, they're just doing the Facebook social media thing, then they really shouldn't have too much to say about civil law, because they're not really paying attention to it, and they're kind of ignorant. But probably the more important thing is that a lot of you had never heard of the common law, which is judicial made law. Again, going back to the Facebook thing, some people think that judges don't make law. Historically, scientifically, and factually incorrect. In fact, this is the English legal tradition. That's what you're learning in this class. It's all about the common law. I have to introduce civil law so that you understand that there's a thing called common law. And I would put civil law and common law is like civil law is public law, and common law tends to be private law. And a lot of people don't know the difference between those two things as well. So I'll need you to go online and look up YouTube to see what's the difference between the public sphere and the private sphere, because that's something that you really should have learned in high school. And I couldn't possibly explain it in this video. But in a nutshell, in the United States legal tradition, you are afforded private rights, meaning that you're protected against both the government and other private individuals. And the government would be the public sphere. And so I know it's hard for a lot of you. In New York, for example, it's very public driven. But in other states like Colorado, Washington State, Idaho, Kansas, right, it's much more private. They have a very small public sector. And so, the common law is much more important to those places than civil law. Now, finally, Article 3 of the United States Constitution is the law, the text of what the judiciary is, of what judges are, of what the court system is. So you should know that by memory, right? You should memorize Article 3 of the United States Constitution is the judiciary. You should read it. You should go to the Constitution. And obviously, every resident and citizen of a country should read the rules of that country. But, I can't force you. But you should read the Constitution. But in particular, legal system is Article 3. Then, what's one right? It's the only right actually guaranteed in the Constitution, and that's that all criminal cases will be by jury. Now, that puts the plea bargain in unconstitutional water, right? Because those people aren't getting a jury trial, which would be a violation of constitutional legal theory. Again, it happens. It happens all the time. In fact, it's like 95% of cases. So you have to think about why society is not enforcing that particular law against police officers, against courts, and against prosecutors. Now, a lot of you got this wrong. Again, I'm going to go back to the Facebook, social media, TV culture. But, white people is not a thing. I'll say it again. White people is not a thing, and the same thing that, purple people are not a thing. Whiteness is a certain cultural expectation that occurs in this particular time period. And I talk about that in a number of videos, and I'd be happy to talk to you about that more often. But the legal system is not based on whiteness. It might apply whiteness, but it's based in the English, particularly the Anglo-Saxon or West English tradition. That's an important construct because it's not the Dutch tradition. It's not the Spanish tradition. It's not the Mexican tradition. It's not the American Indian tradition. It's not the Chinese tradition, right? It's an English tradition because it was, America was founded by English colonizers. Very different than the Spanish colonizers that went down to the Caribbean and went into, Columbus. So there's a lot of misinformation. If you try to simplify the story down to 30 minutes, but I would hope that at least this basic thing that you'll remember is that this legal system is mostly built on the English legal system. The next reading you're going to have in part 3 is about Blackstone, an English legal philosopher, of which many of the founders read and then applied a lot of those methods. So in reflection, I think you need to think about this. Why did so many of you get the answers wrong? It's simple. The sources of your knowledge up to this point have been problematic. So the education system is not real great at teaching about law, right? It teaches mostly about socialization, how you can get along with other people. It's political, right? So the right wing will say, well, we don't want you to talk about evolution. The left wing says, well, we don't want you to talk about racism, right? So you get kind of a middle ground, which is never very good. So you're going to have to go out and get your own education if you want to get a more historical, accurate understanding of the system. Media is just, that might be the one thing I agree with Trump. I think the media is important and you should have it. There should be people reporting accurately, but that's not the world we live in. We live in just, pure nonsense most of the time. Frankly, students ask me, what news source do you read? I only read The Economist, which is a British publication that's mostly talking about economics, because I know they're going to be critical of the United States, and I'm not going to get a bunch of nonsense. I'm going to get pure economic analysis, and then obvious opinions that are based on the British system. I recommend, like, if you come from another country, especially, read their news about the United States, because at least it's biased and they're not pretending to be patriotic or whatever all these crazy news sources say they are in this country. But the day-to-day horse race mentality of the news, is giving you like 1,000 snapshots, but you're never thinking, you're never reflecting. So I would ignore most of the media if I were you and I wanted to be a good student. At some point you're just going to have to put those things down and read books if you want to do well in college. And a lot of students talk to me after they graduate Kingsborough and they go to John Jay, especially, and they're like, oh, we just weren't prepared. Prepare now. Start reading as much as you can, and don't think that you can learn, from memes and short blurbs. Family and social relations also provide misinformation. You need to agree with certain things to get along well with your family members, but you don't have to argue with them, right? They can believe what they believe, and you can learn new things. Which gets me to your lived experiences. This is probably the best form of knowledge. If you're listening to what you know and what you've seen with your own two eyes, so you say something like, everyone has the right to Fourth Amendment, but then you go outside and you see somebody getting illegally stopped and frisked by a police officer, use your eyes. Your eyes just told you the truth. Everybody does not have a Fourth Amendment right. And then I'm giving you new knowledges, right? New points of view. It's not one single thing. It's coming from different points of view. But I've been studying this for a long time. I've read a lot of books, and I'm giving you that information. You're more than welcome to read those books as well. But obviously in a 6-week course, we're trying to give you just the basics so that you can move on with your life. So why does this matter? Critical thinking is not just a buzzword. It's not just something I say and then you magically do. This is the point in the learning process where you're going to have the hardest time, because you're getting a lot of new information. Not all of it's going to make sense, right away. Sadly, as a teacher, a lot of, I wish I heard from more students, but a lot of students will talk to me 6 months from now, a year from now, and say, I got it. Something happened to them. They read another book. They were talking with somebody and suddenly okay, it clicked. That's just the nature of knowledge, right? It doesn't happen right away. Otherwise, I'm not sure why you would even need me or any teacher, right? You could just look at something and you'd automatically know it. So if you're resisting, if it's trouble, you're having a hard time, that's good. It's like you're working a new muscle, right? It's getting stronger. It's going to hurt a little bit, but you're going to come out smarter, right? This is because you're modifying your previous learning. Okay, you're taking what you knew and now you're changing it. You're adapting, you're adding, you're taking things away, and that's what makes it hard. The next set of readings are the ones where I really want you to try to open your mind and try to think critically about these readings, especially as you're going through the student responses, right? What are they getting right? What is still based in like wishful thinking, right? Which of it is reflecting the way that people make rules as they go so that things become important to them? And then, what of it is kind of based in prejudice? What is it based in systemic racism, not individual prejudice, right? But prejudice of an entire group of people. And how does that talk about what whiteness would be as opposed to what the English tradition is, which are not the same things. So that's just a way of thinking about this. Take a second, right? Write some things down. Go back and look at those right answers again. And if you really want to do this well, if we were in class right now, I would have you spend about 15 minutes, writing a short essay just using all those right answers, right? To make sure that you can use your legal knowledge well. So you might try that if you have the time. I know time's tough, but that's one of those things where you can churn off your computer, you can churn off, the internet, and just take out an old school piece of paper and just try to write down those new terms in a way that you can use them regularly. That will greatly improve how you're going to do on your final project and your final exam.